When it comes to having a career abroad, many of my guests seem to have planned for the process early. If you remember the episode with Whitney Marin, you might know she entered college with the plans of studying abroad as the eventual stepping stone to living in France to progress her media career. Or Asil Diab, who grew up as a third culture kid. She was almost already destined to study on the U.S. home campus of her college. But for Dr. Londi Cox, her route was a little bit different. She knew she wanted to be in the helping profession, but it was actually the encouragement of an academic mentor that led her to taking part in semester at sea that would ultimately spark the international bug. Years later, as a practicing child and family therapist, she opted to take a sabbatical from her job so that she could learn Spanish in Spain. And she hasn't worked stateside since. With a doctorate degree in international psychology, Londi has studied the field across 18 different countries throughout North and South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia to be able to provide culturally contextual interventions for the population she serves. She has over 10 years of experience providing cultural competent therapy to individuals, couples, families, and groups living and traveling abroad. In this episode, Londi highlights her career pathway of leaving a job she loved to find opportunities that allowed her to work in mental health in international settings. She discusses some of the common challenges she sees among expats and traveler clients. She also talks about what she thinks makes her relatable to those she works with. Welcome to the Global Chatter. Okay, so back with the latest episode of the Global Chatter. If you've listened to the intro, which most of you do to get to this point, you will know that Dr. Londi Cox is my guest today. And I get excited because when it comes to mental health and mental wellness and everything that comes a part of that, I don't think I can ever have enough of these professionals on this show, because moving abroad and just dealing with yourself in a different space requires a lot of mental exertion and energy. And so, Londi, I am so happy you are with me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me.
And in true time check fashion, I always have to start off with, people listen to this, they know this. Where in the world are you currently?
So I'm in Okinawa, Japan. So it's about 7:30 p.m. for me.
So what y'all know is that that's like 13 hours ahead of me. So yeah, some of us are doing this really early. And in your case, it's not late, but it's
right.
The day. The day is kind of done. Although
right.
is it really done when you're working?
Right. Right. No.
So, okay. This is where I like to start with everyone. Where'd you grow up?
So I'm from Los Angeles, California. So I spent majority of my life there. And really, when I say LA to people who don't know California, but like people who do know California, I grew up in the suburbs. So just 30 minutes south of Los Angeles in this small little city called Lomita. And I would say probably the closest place to that is Long Beach, where people really can kind of like put that on the map. So I grew up there majority of my life. And there were parts, my younger, like I would say single digits, I did grow up in LA proper. So I am the youngest of 5. And so in the household, so in that my 3 older brothers are older, at least 20 to 30 years my senior. So in the household, it was my sister and I, who are 17 months apart. So we're like basically twins, and at least one of the brothers at any given time. But I kind of set that stage for you to say that we did move around a lot. We're not like military kids or anything like that. We were just broke. We were poor. And so we had to bounce around from house to house. And so there was a part of my life where it was LA. And then my dad wanted to move us out of LA because it was just really dangerous and he wanted a different lifestyle for us. And so we moved to the suburbs. But even there, we moved around quite a bit.
So this
absolutely has nothing to do with anything, but you're from the area. And so this is like one of those random things I saw somewhere. So I was on TikTok because all good things happen on TikTok.
Right.
And this guy, you were talking about Long Beach, and I've never been there, and I've been to LA, but I haven't been to the areas really outside of it. And this guy made a map. He's from the area, but he literally made a map, but he's like, I made this map in a way that New Yorkers would understand. Now, I'm not a New Yorker either. Did you see that? And he basically, right, he basically like took New York City and said, okay, if you lived here, this is where it would be. And so in my mind, I could visualize where Long Beach was on this map based on a map of New York, which makes no sense.
That's hilarious.
But that's why I'm like chuckling inside. I'm like, okay, that TikTok was helpful.
Well, so kind of not on the same subject, but I just texted my sister a couple of weeks ago. And I said, do you know how long it takes, or like in miles or in minutes, like how long it takes to get from our parents' house to the church that we grew up in? And so she's like, no, why? And so I said, well, it's 23 miles, which normally takes roughly about 26 minutes. And she was like, where did that come from? And I said, I just remember once Dad walked in and said, the church is this distance away. But that's my rubric. So even driving in Japan, if I see not so much my gas light, but I'll watch my tank as it goes down. And I'll say to myself, is where I'm going the same distance? Like, can I get to my mom's house to church if I were driving to this place? And that's how I know if I need to stop and get gas or not.
It's amazing the way our brains will come up with anything but just like figuring out where you are. In Okinawa, what's 26 miles look like?
No.
Let me take it to somewhere that I know. It's like, I could use an Okinawa landmark, but why would I do that?
Right.
No, that's
center. Yeah.
Right. It's hilarious. I was like, oh, I can make my way around LA now. I really can't. But I was just like, if I imagine it's New York, a completely different city, I know where I'm going.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I do ask this question, and I don't know if this was the case for your family, but, you know, is your family like, have they been in, like, as far as your immediate family or even your extended family, have they been in California for quite a bit, or did they move from a different part of the U.S.?
So my mom is originally from Louisiana, and I believe she moved maybe 7 or 8 or so, maybe a little earlier, but she definitely went to school there. A lot of she doesn't really have like the Southern accent, but a lot of her sentence structures, or like just some of the things that she would say, you definitely know that her roots are elsewhere. So my grandmother and grandfather, before he passed away, they were both there. And then my grandmother came over to California first, and she brought all the children over. But we would go to family reunions in Louisiana, if not every summer, every other summer. And then my dad, his family, for as long, I know that they have roots elsewhere, but for as long as I know, they've been in California. So all of our family reunions were in California. But for the most part, in terms of traveling, as we were, being younger, it was just going back and forth to Louisiana, sometimes Texas. And a lot of times we were caravanning. So it was stopping through these states on the way. But yeah, so that's the extent of where my family is from. But outside of that, I think once my mom got to California, my dad's not really, in terms of domestic travel, my dad's not really into traveling. So once she got to California, it was basically a wrap, and she's been there since.
And that's what, and I think you definitely answered where I was going, is that obviously with a lot of Black stories, a lot of Black migration stories, specifically Black American stories, there are these great, our family's here, but we have roots in other places. Yeah. And so that's where, for a lot of people, the early travel is. Now, with that being said, did your family have the opportunity or the ability to travel outside of the U.S. when you were younger?
So I do recall once in high school, for I think my parents' anniversary, they went to St. Lucia, and I thought that was the coolest. We didn't go, but I thought that was the coolest thing. But my dad was a percussionist. It had to have been before the children were born. So he's traveled all over the world, and he would randomly just throw these stories in, like, oh yeah, in London they drive on this side of the road. Oh, in Paris, like they hold like girlfriends hold hands, between platonic friendships. Oh, here and there. And so we would just get these random like global Snapple facts, here and there.
That's hilarious. I'm going to steal that, global Snapple facts. That's that's very niche. If you've never had Snapple as a drink, for those of you who are not American or don't drink this, I used to love Snapple, but yeah, they'd have these weird facts that just randomly were on the bottle. Okay.
Yeah. So my dad had that experience. He's been literally just about everywhere. And then my mom, not so much.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so I guess then, this always leads to where I wonder, especially with this kind of podcast, is that, and for some people, this is in college or after college or even beforehand. Did you have an anticipation, or did you think, okay, I'm going to travel abroad? And did you even think maybe at some point I'm going to live abroad?
So I'll say yes and no. So I knew in the second grade, so I knew I was going to be a psychologist from the second grade, but the only thing that, yes. Wow. Mainly because I'm nosy and I really love hearing people's stories. And so that was true in the second grade as well. So I had this best friend who was actually being physically abused by her father. And she disclosed that information to me. She was like, you can't tell anybody. And so before I knew what the secret was, I promised her I wouldn't tell, but she showed me all of her bruises and I ended up going to tell the principal. And that's actually the last time I've seen her, and I have been looking for her since. But like in that, I knew that I still wanted to help people. I wanted to hear people's stories. So I did know that I wanted to be a psychologist. Previous to that, though, I knew I also wanted to be an astronaut. And so I guess in the childhood logic of that is I knew I wanted to help people and I knew I wanted to be abroad. But I think my childhood mind only knew let's leave Earth. And so, let's just get out of this environment and let's explore other things. So I've never been fearful of just kind of leaving my surroundings. So again, that's rooted in childhood logic. The desire to live abroad so I didn't know early on that I would live abroad. So the way that I got introduced to traveling, it wasn't until my collegiate years. Freshman year, I walked into my sociology class, and the way that my sociology teacher introduced herself was, hey, you might have seen me on Real World versus Road Rules, on the episode where they do this this semester at sea program. So it's this ship that circumnavigates the world, and she's talking about it. She was like, yeah, I was the dean of social sciences on this ship. And so I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I went up to talk to her after class, and and I used to watch Real World versus Road Rules, but I didn't know. Yeah. Yes, I loved it.
Can I interject? Yes. Also having nothing to do with anything. So I just got Paramount Plus. I swear this is going somewhere. And I've been watching The Real World Homecoming.
Oh, nice.
So it's the old, they had New York, which everybody might know the very first cast. I was on LA, watching LA. Mm-hmm. They have New Orleans. And then I got down to, I started laughing. You said World Rule versus Real World. And I was like, I was watching the challenge when they started, doing the obstacle, whatever, competition. Uh-huh. And they brought back the All-Stars. So they brought back people. The very first female winner was a Black woman who was on the Real World versus Road Rules. And so you said that. So I was telling my friend this the other day. She goes, oh, yeah, you remember when they had Semester at Sea? It's really funny that you said this.
How funny.
And I was like, yeah. And then she's like, I wanted to be on Semester at Sea. And so the fact that it's kind of this, I know, this is the random pieces of my life. Right. I'm like, I did not think that the Real World or Road Rules would pop up in this conversation and specifically
be relevant.
Semester at Sea. Right. And so, oh my gosh. No, that's super cool though. Aside, that's really cool that she had that experience.
Yeah, I agree. And so I went up to her after that class and just introduced myself. And I don't remember the content of that conversation, but she went on to be my mentor. And so in her mentorship, she kept saying, you need to apply for Semester at Sea. And so I had never been out the country at that point. So this was freshman year that we had that conversation. She became my mentor, I think, the following term. So I had never been out the country. So what should have been my junior year of school, so my third year ended up being my final year because I just flew through it. And so when I was talking to her, she was like, well, you have all of these units. You have enough to kind of take it easy if you want to apply for Semester at Sea. And so I ended up applying for Semester at Sea. I went to school in Northern California. So I left LA, went to school in Northern California. And so flew home to LA, and then my mom picked me up from the airport, and then we drove down to San Diego where the boat was docked, and that's where the application interview process was, and I actually got accepted on the spot. And so they're like, yeah, see you in fall. And I'm like, okay. And so like literally had never been out the country before at that point. So I must have been roughly about 17, 18 or so. Yeah, about 17, 18. And so got in and came back and told my mentor that, and then started preparing. And so even to the point where when I boarded the ship, so we left out of, where did we leave? I was going to say St. Lucia, but that's not right. Out of Nassau, the Bahamas. So we left out of the Bahamas, and I remember being in there with my cabin mate, and I was looking at the map, and I was like, so what country are we going to? And she was like, the world. Like, we're going around the world. And I'm like, oh, like literally had
you didn't know. Because you just got on a boat now. But here we are.
Exactly. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, that's pretty cool. And so like, I didn't get like better with geography and just kind of knowing that until that. So we were, you know, as we kind of went around the world and stopped in different countries, then I would like, you know, mark it on my map. And then after that, that's when like the travel bug really bit me, because so even then, even once I left semester at sea, so we did go to about 16, 17 different countries in that trip in the span of 4 months. And so then I came back. Before I left, I had a promise of a job at Target. I did some internship, and so came back and was an executive at Target and was planning going, even though I knew I wanted to be a psychologist at 7, I was like, I'll just, you know, climb up this corporate ladder. The money was amazing. So I'm like, okay, like I'll just do this here. But ultimately, like after a couple of years, that retail life is just not the life that I signed up for. No, actually, that was just a year, because I took a year off between undergrad and grad school. So that's kind of what launched me to get my master's degree. So I went back. So that same mentor asked me what my end goal was. I said, I really want to do therapy. And so that's when she like gave me a different options for those degrees. So I went back, got my master's in social work, mainly because I wanted to go the full like psychology PsyD route. But I also wanted to make money while I was like what before I can. So I knew that I was going. Well, I knew with the psychology degree I needed a doctorate, and so you can't start seeing patients until you have that doctorate degree. And so she said, if you get your master's, then you can do. You could just get licensed. You can start seeing patients. If you decided to continue on towards the doctorate, you can. But in the meantime, you can still be a practicing clinician. And so that was one of the reasons why I chose that route, in conjunction with it being more of a global degree. I could do like individual therapy, family therapy. I could do macro work, micro, you know, everything in between. So that's kind of what led me there. So I did semester at sea, worked at Target for a year, and then went back to school to get my master's degree.
And so here's what I'm so fascinated with your story, because obviously you eventually got your PhD, right? Mm-hmm. Is that I love that the more I read your story, that there was an intentionality to what eventually took you abroad. Because one of the things that when I'm talking to people, or one of the questions about that folks always have is, okay, they want to go abroad. They have a career, right? And they're like, how do I take that career abroad? How do I make money or whatever? And so, and I would love to hear this kind of in your own words, because I know that you worked in your space in the States for like 6-7 years before you were able to like start this international thing.
Yes.
And so can you kind of walk through, you know, you were working in child and family therapy. Can you kind of walk through at the point where you're like, okay, I think I want to go abroad, and how you were able to do that? Because I think especially with what you do, you know, I think it's a little bit different if you're in like IT, right?
Yes.
But because you have a very specialized, particular, at least in the US, regulated training, what did that look like for you, especially when you made the decision to go abroad, and where did you go?
Yeah. So I had wanted to live in England. So in my master's program, I studied abroad again, went to a couple of places in Europe. And then there was a opportunity on the table for me to basically work with my master's in like social welfare in England. The relationship that I was in at the time, I decided not to go abroad because it just would have gotten too complicated. So passed up on that opportunity. I was living in Oregon at the time. Absolutely loved the job that I was working at in Oregon, but there were two clinicians there who spoke Spanish and they were making more money than me. And I was like, excuse me? And so I had this bright idea, move to Spain and learn Spanish. And so it literally was just, like what other options are there? I actually was in a Spanish class, but I was like, I'm not going to get this as fast as I would if I would to just immerse myself. So I was working at a clinician had just gotten licensed, and then decided, and I went to my boss and I said, listen, keep my job open. I'm going to go to Spain for a year. I'm going to pick up Spanish and I'm going to come back. And my supervisor was bilingual as well. And she was like, yeah, that's actually how I learned Spanish. So yeah, we'll agree to do that. And so I literally sold everything that I had. So it was like the timing was so perfect because like my lease was just about to be up. There was just like different things that freed me from, from being in America. So my lease was about to be up. And so I just sold everything. I sold my car, I sold my couches. I sold like literally everything, that wouldn't fit in. I think I took about 2 or 3 suitcases. And then I started looking up so with the visa process, I'm like, okay, so how can I sensibly get to Spain? So I knew that I wanted to be a student. I knew I wanted to pick up Spanish, but I'm like, where is this money going to come from? I knew that I had a savings. And so with all of these kind of like moving parts, I found a program, an au pair program, where I was able to live and work with the family, teaching the children or talking to the children in English. They provided housing and like I think a weekly stipend. And then I enrolled in a language class. So all day while the children were at school, I was at school learning Spanish, and then talking to them in English at their level helped me to learn Spanish because I was understanding like, okay, if I have to speak at this basic level in this sentence in English, this is what it means in Spanish, and they would speak back to me. So it was really the all around good for me in terms of learning and everything like that. And then in terms of money, I'm like, as long as I have shelter and food, like everything else is extra. Like I'm only here to learn Spanish. I found out how easy it was to travel around Europe in general. And so the travel became extra. But so that's what caused me to leave America was that, okay, I know that I have a job to come back to. I know that I have the finances to be able to fund myself. I have a clear purpose of why I'm going abroad. And then one of my cousins gave me the best advice ever. And she was like, if you don't like it, home will always be home. Like just get back on the plane and come back. And I'm like, yeah. And so I think with that advice, I'm like, I could literally go as far as I want to go because I know that home essentially will always be there. So I left. I started school, like I think the second day that I was in Spain, and about 6 months in, I decided that I wasn't moving back to America. So I called my boss, and I was like, you don't have to keep it open no more. Like I'm picking up Spanish, but I'm also not going to be back. And so, yeah,
it's been real, but
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I mean, here's the reality. You were invested in learning a language. You were building an experience, right? In terms of being an au pair, you'd sold your stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you were kind of on this wheel.
Yeah.
Right. And so what year was this?
2014. I think at the top of 2014, either 2014 or 15. I always get those confused, but one of those.
And that's when you
made
the decision. That you were gonna. And so the question always becomes, okay, you are not going to be an au pair for forever. So how long did you stay in Spain, and what were you able to do while you were,
Yeah. So I was in, so I stayed with that family. So I just had the best experience because I became friends with other au pairs. So I was older than, other au pairs. Like typically people do that maybe fresh out of college. I think I was like 27 or so when I decided to do that. So because I was 27 and because they knew that I was a therapist, they're like, how about you teach our kids life skills? And I'm like, great. So it was less of like, hey, teach them English. And the children were a little bit older. They were just about transitioning out of needing an au pair anyway. The girl was like walking around in my heels. It was like the cutest thing. And so I would take them to the grocery store and I would say like, okay, like, let's talk about, like, how would you spend this money? Or, and I would give them like more so like life scenarios as opposed to like phonetics and, different things like that. So the parents appreciated that, but then they realized like our children are actually a little older. They don't really need this anymore. So I stayed with one family for about 6 months. And then I transitioned because I had like a year kind of term set up. So then I transitioned with another family for another 6 months. And that family, they own 2 houses. So I literally just stayed in their other house down the street. So had my own life and would just go over and help out with the kids and with dinner and different things like that. And again, with them, because I was older, was teaching life skills as opposed to like, actual au pair stuff. But then a friend of mine was like, you spent all that money on school and you're just going to be out here in Spain teaching English and that's it. Because in my mind, I was like, this lifestyle of being abroad is just so much to me, so much better than being in America. And to translate your degree to Spain, like in Spain where I was, would have been so difficult. It would have taken like a lot of time. So I'm like, I'm cool with just teaching English. And just like the lifestyle to me justified the lifestyle, or justified the switch in lifestyle. But then I'm like, well, I did spend a lot of money on my degrees and a lot of time, and I would like to go back to that salary because that was also really nice. Right. So then I started just like Googling positions of LCSWs abroad, therapists abroad, and just like tried to figure it out. So I ended up stumbling on, I didn't know anything about contract work, but ended up stumbling on this. I guess I sent this email out and they responded to me like 6 months later. And they were like, hey, actually, we have a position. And so they had 3 open. They had one in Tokyo, one in England, and one in Germany. So I chose Tokyo. And just before that was able to happen, they were like, oh, the person in that role actually renewed their role. So now we only have England and Germany. And so I was like, well, I just learned just learned Spanish. I don't really feel like learning another language right now. I didn't want to add German into the mix. So I was like, just send me to England. And so that's how I ended up going back into therapy. But it was literally an extensive Google search. But what I thought was really interesting about my own story is that initially when I wanted to move abroad, I wanted to go to London. And I passed on that position, ended up in Spain, but ultimately ended up in England. But when I wanted to go to England, I wanted to be in Japan. That position passed up on me and then ultimately ended up in Japan. So everything was like, no, we're going to get you there.
All right, so we're back after the break, and if you heard Londi's story, you will know that at this point she's in England. Took the long way route to get there, but she got there. And one of the things that as we were talking off air, I am very interested in understanding is you've gotten your master's at this point. You're working, you got it. You're working in England. Mm-hmm. How were you able to do your doctorate? Because I'm presuming you did not come back to the U.S., correct?
I did not come back.
This part I want people to hear sometimes because I'm like, you did your education abroad. Mm-hmm. Where did you do? Where did you ultimately get your doctorate completed through?
So ultimately, I got it done through the Chicago School of Professional Psychology.
Okay.
even though I knew that I was going to be a psychologist, I don't know that I thought I had the forward thinking of knowing that I was going to get my doctorate degree, because once I became a clinician, that's really what I wanted, was just to be the clinician. But what ended up happening was, and I'll tell you how I ended up like going to school in America, but what ended up happening was the position that I got in England. A lot of people, I was the youngest person working there as a clinician. Everybody was older than me. A lot of people take the role that I had at retirement age. So I said, here I am at the start of my career doing things that people are doing at the end of their career, making that same salary. Why would I limit myself here and not get it? So a couple of people there like talked to me about getting a degree. So then I actually decided to go to Cambridge, because I was right up the road from Cambridge where I was working. So I said, okay, I'll get a doctorate degree at Cambridge. Was one of like 5 finalists, but ultimately didn't end up getting into the school. And so I was already invested at this point in getting a doctorate degree. So I'm like, well, now I have to figure it out. But the only thing, because I was able to be a clinician, I didn't really want a degree in just anything. And then I came across this program that the Chicago School of Professional Psychology has in international psychology. So the doctorate is in international psychology. So it studies American psychology in juxtaposition to how psychology is studied in cultures all around the world. Okay. And just me being who I was and, already an expat for, I think 5-6 years at that point, I knew that that was the degree for me. So I ended up applying for that, getting in. And so they had actually, at that point, for whatever reason, I can't remember now, I was thinking about transitioning back to America to do the degree. And for whatever reason, I decided last minute that I wasn't going to do it, wanted to continue to live abroad. So they switched me to the online program, and I was able to do the full 3 years. I think the degree was the full 3 years abroad.
Wow. So you you stayed abroad. You were able to still work your job.
Correct.
And you did
the hardest thing I've ever done.
Right.
Yes.
And you did your degree. Like, I'm saying it slow, not because I didn't hear you, but I want other people to hear, like, that's the path you took and we're able to do your degree. So at that, how long did you end up living in England?
I was there for 5 or 6 years, I believe. I think I left just under the 6-year mark. Okay.
Did you leave like relatively soon after completing your degree, or did you still stay for a little bit?
I completed my degree in October. I flew home to defend, and I came back and gave my notice. So 2 weeks later, I left and went to Tanzania, lived my best life.
Oh, you just
came to Japan. Yeah, I was like,
did you go on vacation, or you just went to go live in Tanzania?
Yeah, that was vacation. No, that was vacation. So I got majority of the degree during COVID. Okay. And so I will say that downtime. So I was I still had a full caseload. But that definitely helped. So the first year, it was business as usual, like going to work for whatever time and then coming home and doing work. Because my degree was in international psychology, I had to do 2 international trips, and my research had to be in international. You would think that because I'm already living internationally, I would choose England, but no, I wanted to like learn about something else. But I say that to say there were times where my second international trip was supposed to be in the Philippines. This is in the height of COVID, so we couldn't travel there like we were supposed to. Right. So I'm in class in the Philippines on Philippine schedule. Didn't think to take off work. So I am in class all through the night and then just going straight to work and then coming home and sleeping right after work. So I say that to say, so yes, I did it abroad, but there were times where I had to match my time zone to the respective country that I was studying in or like doing that. So it literally was the most difficult thing that I've ever done, working and going to school at that level. And my degree itself was a accelerated program. So it was a 5-year program done in 3 years that I did in conjunction with
because you couldn't make it any more difficult. You're doing an American doctorate while living abroad in the middle of a pandemic and working full time and doing, like having to do 2 research assignments in different countries. Cause that, of course, is what everybody does. But
in Spanish, in Spanish, but
what I was going to say is this. I think that when I know the stories, I hear the stories and people come on and it seems like it's just so easy for you to get to where you've gotten to, especially when people sort of see you. There's just an assumption of, oh, these things fall apart and I have to, or fell into place. And I have to say, no, it's so easy for them to actually fall apart. What it is the intentionality of the people and it takes work to kind of build the life you want. So with that being said, obviously you took an opportunity that has taken you to Japan. Finally. And you also, you've got your private practice in what you're doing as a psychologist. One of the things that I'm very intrigued in hearing from you is that at what point did you decide, okay, as far as clients that I'm going to work with, at least in your business, that you wanted to work with expats, and what was sort of the catalyst for that?
I think it was in Madrid, honestly. So in Madrid, that was the first time, that was my first living abroad experience, but there was a group that I am still a part of called Melanin Madrid. And so we would all get together for just different things, and people would talk about the Black experience abroad, or, microaggressions, or them gaslighting themselves, like, am I tripping, or like, are they looking at me funny? And are they looking at me funny because I'm Black, or because I'm a woman, or because I'm American? And so it's all of these like different nuances to where it's just like, do I trust my gut, or like, because I'm in a different culture, do I try to figure out these cultural norms? So I think it was in, because I was already thinking with a clinical brain, like I had already been clinically trained once I moved, I was seeing these things through a different lens. And then once I moved to England, it was, other things were, coming up with the population that I was working with. It was couples coming to me like, hey, I followed my partner abroad, but I gave up a really good job back there. And so now we're having concerns, or now we're raising this child, and I really want them to know their American heritage, and they really want them to be like rooted in this. And so we're having issues because of that. And so I would say it would be all of my kind of like living abroad experiences, to where I was finally like, oh, I can help them. Like, because 1, I've lived it. And then 2, I have the clinical kind of expertise there. And then when you throw in my doctorate degree that literally focuses on cultural psychology, and not so much saying American psychology is the best way to handle this, but it's also understanding the nuances to how African cultures would handle needing mental health, or how, like Asian cultures. And so it's being able to put all of those pieces in together.
Wow. So I guess I'm intrigued. Were you finding, at least earlier on, or even now, were you getting clients who were predominantly American or in American partnerships, or were you starting to see folks who were coming from other places, but the commonality was that they were living in a country that they are not from, or that they moved to?
I would say predominantly Americans living abroad. And I think that's just because of the connection that they had. Like, a lot of times people will come to me and say, I really wanted another American, or another Black woman, or another Black person, or a woman, or, an English speaker. I get that a lot. I really wanted, I really wanted an English speaker.
Yeah,
exactly. And so I think because of the specifics that they're looking for, I think it led a lot of Americans to me. I think only very recently am I getting other culture, like 2 different cultures that are, when I talk about couples, like 2 different cultures that have come together. But I would say majority of my practice are Americans living abroad. And really, if I'm being honest, Black people living abroad.
And I could see that. I think that, and I mean, let's be fair. I think if you were in the States, right, let's remove the expat stuff, there would still be an attraction to the fact that you are a woman of color, and I always say finding a therapist or a counselor, psychologist is an intimate thing, right? Because I'm telling this to you, but other people who haven't had therapy is you are in a vulnerable state with somebody you are not partnered to, and is not in your family.
Yes. Exactly. And is not, just sharing off.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so I can imagine. And then coming from, depending on your background, subculture, how they deal with therapy and their ideas around it. Right. You can be real suspicious, and it's not fair because there are great counselors and therapists that do not necessarily look like you or a person. Right. But you can get a little bit suspicious and be like, but I trust her though, because I know she gonna understand.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So I imagine you probably find that where, especially being American, that there are probably folks who are like, okay, there's just stuff I know I don't have to explain to you, or feel like I have to explain.
Yes. I remember I did a consultation call with this girl, this woman of color. And so she was explaining something to me. She was like, oh, I really want to go out, but I also have to take down my hair. And just being able to say that, I'm like, yeah, taking down your hair takes like 6 hours. So it's just like, and so what we talked about later on, she was able to say, it's like, just being able to say those things and not have to explain like, oh, well, a wash day takes this longer, doing this takes this or whatever, like just being able to say that sentence and move on, or you just get exactly the time frame. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people look for that comfort, especially like what you're talking about. If I'm going to be in this vulnerable space with you, like, I don't want to have to explain everything. I don't want to have to explain the backstory. And I think that for expats specifically, I do get a lot of the population from Madrid as well. I think what draws people to me is, again, the English speaking, but it's not, they also don't have to say, well, this is how it is in Madrid. And like, sometimes you're walking down the streets and the guys call you Moreno and, like that kind of stuff. It's just like, you lived here a year and a half, you know what the situation is. And you've also, are American. So you just understand those nuances, and I can just get on with my story because, I only have an hour anyway,
Right. And as you were talking, you just sort of triggered something for me that I hadn't really thought about, is that if you're in a new culture, you're already finding yourself explaining certain things because you're not part of that community, just as a natural, and especially if that language is not a language you learned and it's a language you're still working through, right? So like even going to the store and explaining, I want an apple, right? Like you find yourself explaining. I can imagine when we put it into a therapeutic setting, you've already spent all day sort of explaining your viewpoint at work or whatever, or just trying to get a taxi. Then to also explain, okay, before I tell you the story, I got to explain the backstory. Could be very
context,
be tiring. So I can see the appeal. And so I'm curious, in the line of work that you're doing, what do you see are some of the most common issues that maybe new expats are struggling with, or even expats who have been around for a while? Like, what are some of the things that pop up that you're like, this in particular is unique to living abroad versus being at home?
Yeah, I would say transition is like one of the biggest ones. That's a lot of times when people seek me out, either if it's in preparation to move, or like I have just moved and I'm just like, I thought it was going to be one way and it's another way. And I'm just like having second thoughts, or I'm not managing this well. So I would say transition would be one. And shortly, like right beneath transition is managing, I don't want to call it expectation, but trying to balance and manage the friendships that you left back home. And so part of that is like, sometimes people have this, the people back home might have a false reality of what life abroad might be. And so going back to kind of the analogy that we were just saying, in terms of if I'm calling and I want to tell, a friend or whatever, like, oh man, I'm having a bad day, or, this is really tough. And the advice you give is like, well, at least you're abroad, or like, at least you get to travel this weekend. Like, that's very dismissive. Yeah. And so a lot of times people they already have a difficult time setting boundaries with their, family and friends and different things like that. And so it's like painting this reality for them. They find a difficult time just kind of balancing their new life with their old life, and managing the guilt sometimes of leaving their old life behind and trying to start this new life. So I see that. And then I do the intercultural relationships as well. So sometimes people either come over on their own, they'll meet their partner, and then they just have differences that they want to converse through. Or like what we were talking about earlier, they'll come over with their partner, but it was a sacrifice for one of them. So yes, this was a good opportunity for you, but I left my good opportunity for you. And so sometimes people feel like this has to work, sometimes at their detriment, because they're feeling like, well, I gave up something great for this to work. And so if this doesn't work, then what does that then say about me? What does that then mean for my life? And, so a little bit of everything, but I would say right in that transition and relationships is what I see a lot of.
So you mentioned managing expectations. So here's where my mind goes. My mind thinks, we'll pick on Spain because we've been talking about Spain all day. And I've been to Spain. Spain's glorious, right? This idea of, okay, I know I'm moving to Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, whatever. I have bought the Kool-Aid. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be sunny. I'm going to meet a Spanish man. I'm going to do all this stuff. Right. And then they get there and they're like, oh my God, you still got to pay bills. You still got to deal with, I'm just making this up. I have no idea. It might be terrible traffic. You still try to figure out, okay, these men are still getting on my nerves, just in a different language.
Yes. Right.
Am I painting this where it's like, I thought I was going to be, I keep thinking on the show, Emily in Paris, because let's say Emily in Madrid.
Yeah.
And really what it's not. Is that what you're seeing with folks?
It's like this glamorized, they glamorize this kind of like living abroad. And to some extent it is, but life is still life. And like transitions are difficult and learning a new language is hard and giving things up, And so there's this thing, I think it's a real thing called, I mean, when I say I think it's a real thing, I don't think it's a term I made up, but toxic positivity.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, oh, I have to be positive because I'm living abroad because I got this opportunity that most people don't get. But it's just like, but your emotions are still valid. And so just because you had different expectations doesn't mean that you have to live in those expectations if it fell beneath your expectations.
Yeah. No, and I think also what you said about, moving abroad and you've got these people at home, I think sometimes they seem to think you're on vacation. Right? Because and this makes sense. Anytime someone associates, I'm going to a different country, especially so let's say they live in the States, right? And your mama comes and visits you in the aforementioned Spain. That's vacation for her. But doesn't realize you living, I know, like logically you're there 365. So it's not vacation for you. It'd be the same as if you were living in Cleveland. Is that where?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the other piece that's like, I guess to that same extent is like really having to figure out everything again. Like, so in America, we have this kind of idea of, if I'm sick, I can go to CVS or to Walgreens and get like cough drops or get what it is that I need. But when you go to a new country, like, so for example, when I lived in Spain, cough drops were kept in the candy aisle. Or if you needed like Tylenol, you actually had to go to a pharmacy. You can't find that in the grocery store. And then when I lived in England, like, I'm like, where's there a Kinko's? And they're like, oh, you have to go to the grocery store in the photo department to make like just regular photocopies. So it's, these things are like super small, but imagine you're on your way to an interview and you're like, oh shoot, I need a Kinko's really fast. I need this, I need cough drops. And it's just like having to navigate like this whole shift of the smallest things. And so when you don't plan for that, and then when people don't understand it, and then when people dismiss it, like it can mess with your mental health. It can throw you, all the way off.
So with that being said, because I'm very invested in helping people do this. You're abroad, you're an expat. How does one even begin to find the therapist or counselor that works for them? And how do they, especially like, once again, we're looking cross culturally or whatever. Like, how do you even, if you're thinking, okay, I've been working with someone while I'm in the States, or I'm in the UK or wherever I'm from, Australia, I would like to continue to work with someone who at least understands the expat space. Like, how do they even go back evaluating, okay, this is going to be the person, or where do I even start to find the person?
I wish there was, because I know that in the States there is, at least for like Black therapists, there's this website where you can go to and like plug in your state and different things. And I haven't seen that overseas. So the way where I promote my business and where people have been finding me are the different expat groups that are on social media and Facebook. And that's even if you can promote your business. Some of them won't even allow you to do that. But in every single region that I've lived in, I've gotten on Facebook and joined a group, like Americans living in England, Americans living in Spain, Black people abroad, like those kind of things. And so I feel like people find it there, and then they find it through word of mouth after you join those kind of communities, whether it's in real life or Facebook. But even as a clinician, I don't know, like, you know, how other people will go and find, because in some countries, therapy itself is not even as widely publicized. And so it's not like in America where you can call your PCM and then say, hey, I need a referral to this place. So it is a little bit more challenging overseas. I will say that.
And you're right. I know that with groups, and I was going to say there are only two groups that I know that list therapist. One of them, because I know the founder, I know that International Therapist Directory. And then there's a second group, and I can remember because their acronym is LIT. Right? Location Independent Therapist. So there you go. I know, and because I know that they also kind of follow us on social media and some other things. And I was like, well, kudos on the acronym. I don't know if that was intentional, but at least in my brain, I'm like, it's lit.
It works.
Like I say, they're not necessarily they're not Black or brown focused, either of them. They're just like, we're therapists that deal with expats, third culture kids and whatnot. And so, you know, one of the things I want to ask you as we start to round up, and I think this is super important. What would you say are some of the tips and advice that you would have for, and I'm going to give you two categories. People who are preparing to move abroad in terms of how should they kind of mentally prepare for that. And then the second category are people who are abroad, and how do you kind of guard your mental health while you're out? So let's start with the first one. So what would you say if someone's thinking about moving abroad? What are some things that you think people should just be mindful and aware of in your experience?
So if people are moving abroad, I definitely say do it, because home will always be home. So even if you don't like it, you can go back. But the other thing is, like, again, managing your expectations. So go into it with a positive, like, this is going to be great, but be okay with changing your mind of saying like, this is not what I wanted. Let me pivot. Let me figure something else out. Let me go back home and, you know, focus, recalibrate. And every time I go through a transition, even though I've been abroad for almost 10 years now, I give myself a year to like fully kind of transition. And I think that if I were to go and think that this is going to be great, in a couple of months, my furniture will be here, my house will be set up. If I blow that suspense and that doesn't happen for whatever reason, like, that's going to leave a sour taste in my mouth about the transition. Versus if I say, okay, it's going to take me a good year to feel set up. If that happens in 2 months, I'm going to be like, oh, wow, this was a great transition. So I would say, managing those expectations up front and giving yourself grace to change your mind in those scenarios, for those who are thinking about going abroad. The last one I would say with that population is, if you can find one, get a therapist, like, just to process that, to go through the transition. If you have everything in your world about to change, it's nice to have some type of consistency and some type of continuity. So sometimes people will book me and say, I don't have anything big going on in my life, but in the event that something big comes up, I want to already have rapport with somebody. I want to know that I can depend on somebody in the midst of everything changing. And so that would be the advice that I would give to people about to walk into transition. And then the people who are already abroad and like managing your mental health. So one of the things that I like to live by is like creating a list of all of the things that you like to do. So all the things that bring you happiness, and then create a list of all the things that you're doing, and then comparing those two lists. And then obviously if those two things aren't adding up, then adjust accordingly, and heavy on the adjust accordingly. Because a lot of the times we'll say like, oh, these are my hobbies, these are my interests, blah, blah, but you look at your day to day and you're not doing any of those things. And so it's just like, okay, so if we want to, we have to be very intentional about managing our mental health. And so, yes, we're living abroad. Yes, it can seem, glamorous, but if we're not doing, like, if we like yoga and we were doing yoga in America, then let's try to do, yoga while we're overseas as well. But to that same regard, sometimes people will get overseas and they'll say, this place doesn't have the hobbies that I had back home that I like. But if you spend your time abroad perseverating over the things that you can't do, then of course you're going to see everything through the negative lens. So I would say to hold on to what you can hold on to, but try to embrace some of the changes that will bring you positivity. I would say is helpful. And then, to the same regard, I'm always going to promote therapy, whether it is in the formal sense of, talking to a licensed professional, or, just having an outlet that works. And when I say outlet, that's not talking to your best, your homegirl. And that's good, but therapy is just not like me listening and talking back. Like, obviously there is a art to it. But I would say, like, in terms of maintaining your mental health, at least having a therapist that you have on retainer, even if you're not seeing them every 2 weeks, that you're checking in with and just saying like, hey, this is where I am. Just want to do a temperature check. So that would be my advice. Okay.
So I think that's great advice, even if you aren't moving in general. But once again, I'm pro counselor and I'm pro therapist. So I'm like, you should do that anyway, whether you're moving to, once again, because we've been picking on Spain or Cleveland. I haven't been to Cleveland. I don't know why I'm picking on Cleveland. But oh my gosh, Londi, this has been amazing information. I have loved hearing your story and just the advice you've given, especially about what to do. I think it's so practical and it's things that anyone can get their hands on. And so before we end, I always like to say, all right, where can people find you?
So professionally, you can find me on social media at Dr. Londi, Londi. And that's both on Instagram and on Facebook. And then personally, you can find me at Londi Aleece. So LondiAleece. And that's where you would see more of my kind of personal travel blogs and so on and so forth. And then you can check out my website, which is drlondi.com. And my blogs are on there, pictures. And then if you sign up for my mailing list, then you get a mental health travel journal.
Very cool. And here's the thing. We're going to have all that in the show notes and it'll be up on our website. Perfect. So the great part is, like I always say, if you miss it, just follow us. We're following her. And you can just find us on social media. You can find her. But thank you for coming on this show. Like I said, I really value your wisdom and your expertise and just for sharing your story.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me. This was such a joy.
You've just listened to an episode of The Global Chatter, which is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is edited by Stephanie Ficcio. Don't forget to subscribe to The Global Chatter on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us on Instagram at The Global Chatter or stop by Twitter and find us at Global Chat Pod. If you have a question, want to subscribe to the newsletter, or are interested in sponsoring, visit theglobalchatter.com.